I have to begin today with a confession related to Girl Scout cookies. I really love Thin Mints. They are my favorite Girl Scout cookie. I know some people really like Samoas, which are like the caramel chocolate ones with coconut on them. They're pretty good, but I'm going to make a bold claim and say they're definitely not the best. I also really like the peanut butter ones. Those are also very good. The peanut butter with chocolate. The peanut butter sandwiches, not so much. Peanut butter with chocolate, very good. Big fan of Thin Mints though. They have to be hands down my favorite. And I think part of the reason that I like them is because they come in the sleeves and not in like a tray. And my specific problem with Thin Mints is it's something like the old Pringles slogan. Remember it? Once you pop, you just can't stop. Once I open a sleeve of Thin Mints, like I cannot stop until I've eaten the entire sleeve of Thin Mints. That is a problem, and I just need to recognize it and confess it to you. But it usually starts innocently enough. I start by just eating like 2 Thin Mints. And then after I have 2 Thin Mints, I say, well, 2 Thin Mints, those are pretty small. I mean, what's 2 more, really? And so then I'll eat 2 more Thin Mints. And then I think, well, really, like, what's 1 more gonna hurt, And then I think, well, but what about just 1 more? And then after that, I think, really, I'll just go back and have 1 more Thin Mint. It's no big deal. And then the next thing I know, over the course of like a couple hours, have eaten an entire sleeve of Thin Mints. It's the same reason that I cannot keep peanut M&Ms in the house. I did this once. I had a very large bag, like the family-sized bag of peanut M&Ms, and I would go by and just grab a handful of peanut M&Ms like it was actually peanuts, but they weren't. They were peanuts covered in chocolate, which is not as good for you as just eating regular peanuts, which is still, even then, questionable to eat the amount of peanuts that I ate, because I literally, when I got to the end of the day, I realized I'd eaten the entire bag of peanuts. And so I just want to pause there for a second and one, acknowledge that is a problem, right? That's not a good thing. And the second thing is, how did I get there? Right? That's what I try to look at is how on earth did I do it? Because that's what I don't know. But when I look at it, I realize that, how did I become the kind of person who could eat an entire sleeve of Thin Mints or eat an entire bag of peanut M&Ms? Well, I did it one choice and one decision at a time, right? You make choices, and then those choices make you until you become the kind of person who can eat an entire sleeve of Thin Mints in one hour. That may sound innocent enough, but let me take another example of parenting. Kids do stuff that frustrates us all the time. And they can do things that are particularly annoying when they do something wrong and then they should feel bad about it, right? We want them to feel some sense of remorse. It's indicative then if they do that they're functioning properly. But when they don't feel a sense of remorse, when they just kind of are indignant or even rude or disrespectful, and then as a parent that tends to make us mad. And so as a parent, I want to correct the behavior. I want to see my kids behave rightly, but more importantly, because I want them to be the kind of person who is respectful and kind and caring and compassionate, right? And so maybe I'll correct their behavior. Maybe I'll say, hey, you need to not do that. And then if there's no response, right, no kind of sympathetic response, no kind of emotional response, no kind of remorse in them, it's really easy to then just pile on and say, hey, will you listen to me? I told you, take care of that. And then still, if there is no response, I find it easy for me to keep piling on until I get some kind of emotional response. And then when I take a step back and I look at it, I realize, hold on, I am the kind of person who will keep badgering my kids until they cry. Now that doesn't sound really cool, because it's not, and it doesn't sound really fun. But it is like the parenting equivalent of eating an entire sleeve of Thin Mints. The fact is that I make choices, and those choices make me. There's this old saying. This is the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And part of what we're going to look at today is how that is absolutely and patently false. The road to hell is not paved with good intentions. The road to hell is paved with bad intentions. Part of the problem is that we do not understand intentions, and we do not understand the idea of goodness and badness. We may want to want the right thing, but very often we don't. Very often what we actually want is the wrong thing. And what's worse is that we know it, but we lie to ourselves and deceive ourselves into thinking that what we really want is actually good, when in truth we know that it's not. The road to hell is paved with bad intentions. Let's go back to my cookie example for just a moment. To want one more cookie is not an inherently bad thing. To want one cookie is not an inherently bad thing. But it becomes a problem when I know in my heart, deep down, I really should stop at 3. And that was kind of the limit that I'd set for myself. And yet when I'm at 3 cookies, well, just one more. That's when it becomes a bad intention. Somewhere in there, that line is crossed between having 2 Thin Mints and eating an entire sleeve. We know we cross that threshold at some point. All of which is, of course, the point of this proverb, this old and ancient proverb from Proverbs 4:23. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. In this series, we're talking about the various parts of ourself and how we are looking to find healing during the season of Lent for ourselves. And I talked about this last week. I invite you to go back and look at that video if you have not watched it, about the parts of the self, how there is the deepest internal part of us, the heart, which is the source of desire and the will, which is what we're going to be talking about today, the heart, the healing of our hearts. There's the heart, and beyond that, there is the mind and the body and our social sphere, the relationships, the closest relationships in our lives, and then beyond that, the soul, which kind of coheres everything together in a unified whole. And so if we're going to make sense of healing our hearts, and how that relates to the idea of intentions, which is intimately related to the idea of intentions, good intentions, bad intentions, choices, and eating an entire sleeve of Girl Scout cookies. Yes, even that. We have to understand what the heart is. Dallas Willard writes, if you would care for something, then you need to understand it. And so whatever else this proverb may mean, guard your heart above all else, for everything you do flows from it. Whatever else that may mean, it requires us to understand our hearts. If we would guard it, if we would care for it, then we need to understand it. If we would seek healing for our hearts, then we need to understand what it is. So, here's the question. What is a heart? When I say that, what might come to mind is like your actual physical heart, with the 4 chambers, and you have aortas and vessels and ventricles and all that stuff. That I am not a heart doctor, so I have really no clue. That is the limit of my heart knowledge that I can give you. That may be the image that comes to mind for you. Another image that's much more popular that comes to mind is the kind of classic triangular heart shape, right? Like this. You see it? That comes up so often, like around Valentine's Day or other things, as a symbol of love, which is really interesting in and of itself, how the heart becomes a symbol of love. But that kind of, pink or red triangular heart symbol, of course, that is not what the heart is in biblical context. Oftentimes, in our kind of popular imagination, the heart is really ambiguous when we talk about it, but it is usually associated with feelings, which is not too far off from the truth, but it's worth digging in and considering what it is. From a biblical sense, the heart and the spirit of a person are largely interchangeable when that's referenced in biblical language. In the older the New Testament, the idea of someone's heart or someone's spirit, it is largely interchangeable. The heart is the deepest part of you. It's the source of your desires, your passions, and your will, your chooser, right? That is what the will is. The will in a human being is their choosing ability, right? My will chooses what I want to happen or what I'm going to do. That's your will. So the heart then is the source of your desires, your passions, and your will. It is unseen. Just because something is unseen doesn't mean it's not experienced or felt. All of us know this to be true, right? You experience or feel someone else's will or someone else's desires, someone else's passions coming out of them. But it is unseen. And in this sense, it is spiritual, and that it's, not materially physical, right? It is unseen, it is spiritual. And so I just want us to think about this then. If your heart is the deepest part of you, the source of your desires, your passions, your will, if it is unseen and thus spiritual in that sense, then I want us to think about God in terms of God's heart. We sometimes talk about that in church, talk about that in churchy kind of language. What is God's heart? God's heart the source of his desire, his will, his passions. It's very essential and core to his identity, if that makes sense. The Apostle John writes that God is love. Love is a will to good, the willing of the good of another. And so as we think about this idea of heart, the source of passion and desire and will, I hope you see how that relates to the identity and the essence of who God is. And that's important because what I want us to then think about is then what is God's purpose? What is God's will? What is God's desire? What is God's passion for human beings? Because we also, created in God's image, have a heart, right? This core, deepest part of who we are that is so central and essential to our identity. When you look at the biblical story then, the purpose of God for humanity is to become a person of love through to the very core, to become like him, in essence, to reflect his character and love into the world, and to reflect the world's worship and praises back to him. Now, back to the proverb, right? Guard your heart above all else, for everything you do flows from it. Part of why the heart is so central is that it's because from the heart that we make choices. And as I said, those choices make us. That is what intentions are. Intentions are choices, and choices are intentions. And so your intentions make you. Jesus, of all the great teachers who have ever lived, I think Jesus has the best insight into the condition of the human heart and explains it in a way that no one else really can or does. To quote Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he said, "The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. This line shifts inside us. It oscillates with the years. And even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, yet one small bridgehead of good is retained." Which brings us to this second idea that I want to spend some time with, which is that the human heart is fundamentally broken, but not irredeemable. The human heart is fundamentally broken, and yet it is not irredeemable. When my oldest, the one selling Girl Scout cookies, was in preschool, she used to come home sometimes, and I picked up on this when I would do something, that upset her. For example, when she did something wrong, and then I'd yell at her, or raise my voice, or discipline her in some way, she would say something to me like, "You wrinkled my heart," which was just, it would have been frustrating if it weren't so darn cute, What does that even mean? I wrinkled your heart. Turns out it was something the kids in the class were saying to each other. Don't really know where that came from or why they were doing it, but they were, right? You wrinkled my heart. Gets at this idea, I think, really well. That as human beings, we all have wrinkled hearts. Our hearts are like raisins, You take a raisin is a grape that has been left out and dried. And much of the liquid has been left from it, so that all you have left is this kind of drier, shriveled form of itself that can survive longer than a grape could on its own. But yet it is not what it was created to be, was it? It becomes something fundamentally different. The human heart is wrinkled. Every human heart is wrinkled, and our problem really is manifold. And it gets this idea of desires and passions and will, right? Because our desires are disordered. To use language from the old reformers, right? We have disordered loves. Is that what we really want is maybe not what is actually best and is not what is good. We have disordered desires. We want things that are not good for us or for other people or for God and his good world that he made. We have disordered desires and ineffective wills. I mean, to reference Paul in Romans 7, we oftentimes know what the good is. We want to choose it, but we don't do it. We choose the wrong thing. We want to choose the right thing sometimes, but often we don't. Sometimes we don't want to choose the right thing, and we know we don't want to choose the right thing, but maybe we want to choose the right thing, and then we still find that we can't do that. We have ineffective wills and disordered desires. But I want us to remember, too, here, it's important to note that the parts of a person do not operate independently. We're going to have to talk about them in some sense independently to make sense of how they are healed, but they don't operate completely independently. The heart, then, as the source of our desires and our passions and our will, is fundamentally wrinkled and broken. And so we have a couple options at this point. And human history shows that there are a few options that wise philosophical teachers, wise religious teachers have taken when it comes to the human heart. Is that on the one hand, you can go the route of the Stoic and the Buddhist, right? Which is to say that really the problem is that we have desire at all. And what you must do to reach a place of enlightenment, or as we talked about last week, this idea of self-actualization, becoming the person that you were meant to be. In order to get there, what we need to do is to eliminate desire. We need to eliminate it. And so we might do really bizarre and weird things to eliminate desire. That is like kind of the Stoic or Buddhist philosophy on it. On the other hand, we might find something we might call like an Epicurean philosophy or a hedonistic philosophy, which is that, no, life is short and what really counts is maximizing my pleasure in it. And so I should just follow my desires. To quote a popular saying, the heart wants what the heart wants. Popularized by Emily Dickinson, I believe, in the 1700s, but more popularly known in a sense of like what happened with Woody Allen in 1992. You know the story? It's interesting. Woody Allen in 1992 left the woman that he'd been seeing for 12 years to date a woman who was 34 years his junior, who at the time was also the daughter of his then girlfriend. Left to be in a relationship with her. Woody Allen was in his 50s. This woman was 22. And when asked about this, because many people had problems with it, you can understand why. When asked about it, his response was, the heart wants what it wants, as a justification for behavior that many people would have considered immoral. And so we have these two options, right? The two options of dealing with the wrinkled human heart. On the one hand, we must obliterate and ignore it, right? To crush desire, eliminate desire, and the idea being therein that you can strengthen and bend the will. The other hand, you have that you can just follow and indulge every desire that you have. These two poles, and yet, as so often is true, the reality is somewhere in the middle. And the Christian life, the way of Jesus, as he taught it and lived it and teaches it and lives it still, is to hold in tension these polar opposites and to walk in truth. The way of Jesus fundamentally disagrees with both. God put your desires within you to be exercised rightly in accordance with a will that's surrendered to him. You don't follow and indulge every desire. At the same time, you should not repress every desire either. But you must honor and acknowledge and follow Jesus and trust that he's going to sort everything out as it needs to be sorted out. That is the biblical answer to this challenge. And Jesus' teaching in Mark 7, I think, is really indispensable in this. This is what we're told in Mark 7. The Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the traditions of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" He replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship of me is in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. You've let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions." Jesus' point is that so often where we fall in both of those polar extremes is that the emphasis is on outward action, right? The emphasis is on outward action in the hopes that somehow it will work its way in. And as true as that is in some respects, I mean, the best lies are things that have elements of truth in them. What Jesus says in this is that, no, it's not about just simply saying the right things. There is a deep inward change that must happen. There's an inward change that must happen. The language that's used throughout the rest of the scripture is a circumcision of the heart and not of the flesh. Of course, circumcision of the flesh was one of the things that marked the people of Israel apart, a sign of the covenant. The sign of the new covenant, Jesus says, "My covenant with you is that your hearts would be circumcised." It is your hearts, this deepest place of your will, your passion, your desire, that will be changed and marked by me. This is a challenge for us because we tend to think that what really counts is our external behavior, and that if we can just modify our behavior, then we can become righteous. But back to Jesus. Again, he called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it's what comes out of a person that defiles them. After he'd left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. "Are you so dull?" he asked. I love that, Jesus. Like, are you guys stupid? Are you paying attention? Listen to Lama's fun stuff. "Are you so dull?" he asked. "Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from outside can defile them? It doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomachs, and then out of the body." In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. Part of the point there is that so often what counted for the people in the first century Jewish world was the keeping of ritual purity laws. It was, again, a distinguishing mark of their faith. And that they thought if they could do so, that was a way of being righteous. Jesus is saying, no, that's not the point. It's not about simply keeping the rules. It's not about just eating the right things, but that the heart itself would become right, that the desires themselves might then become right, that your will itself would then be fully surrendered to God. It says, what comes out of a person is what defiles them, for it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person. It's from the human heart, the source of our desires, the source of our passions, and the source of our will, that all the evil comes in our world. It comes out of us. And the heart then, apart from God, the heart that is not surrendered to God, the heart that is left to its own devices, the heart that is not properly held in God's care and keeping, becomes hardened and incapable of functioning as God designed it to be. And of course, many of our hearts, have been deeply affected and wounded by others, right? You make your choices and your choices make you. You will things, and then the more that you will those things, you increasingly become like those things, right? You are what you eat in a very real sense, right? The choices that you make determine the kind of person that you're becoming. And unfortunately, sometimes part of the challenge of the wrinkled and broken human heart is that there are things that we have not chosen that have deeply touched us also, right? So our problem really is twofold, just to make sense of the broken human heart. Is that on the one hand, it is the bad that comes out of us, and then on the other hand, it is the bad that has come into us. Proverbs 13, the hope deferred makes the heart sick. That when things that I desire do not come to pass, it does get into the heart, and it deadens and dulls desire in me. It literally makes the heart sick, not function it is meant to function. When I consistently will wrong things, it makes the heart sick, in a sense, and it no longer functions as it was meant to function. And so it might be worth looking back over your life and just consider, right, that where have you been disappointed? Maybe both of those, right? On the one hand, where have you desired wrongly? That you could spend a long time sitting with that. Where have you willed knowingly wrongly? And then on the other hand, where have the desires of others overridden your will and your desires? Where have you been deeply disappointed by something that you genuinely wanted that may have been good? All of this is hard. And it gets us at this core and deepest part of who we are. And it gets to the very core of our identity, right? And we may be left wondering, like the prophet Jeremiah, who said this. He said, "The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? Who can get it? Who can make sense of the human heart?" And of course, the answer that the Lord gives to Jeremiah is this in the very next verse: "I, the Lord, search the heart." Whatever the malady, whatever the difficulty, whatever the challenge, Jesus offers healing for the human heart. Psalm 34:18 says that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and he saves those who are crushed in spirit. For all the wounds to our hearts and all the wounds from our hearts, Jesus offers healing and restoration. And I think that a story is perhaps the best way to illustrate this. In John 4, we hear of Jesus going through Samaria en route from Jerusalem to Galilee, and he stops at a little well outside this village of Sychar. And it turns out this well was dug by the great patriarch of the Jewish faith, Jacob, who would later become, his name would be changed to Israel. I mean, literally the father of the tribes of Israel. Jacob digs this well, and Jesus stops outside this well many, many, many centuries later. His disciples go into town to buy food, and Jesus outside of the town of Sychar by this well with a single Samaritan woman there, which in itself is fairly odd to be going in the middle of the day to get water, which is what we're told she's doing. We are told later that this Samaritan woman who was there, that she has been married 5 times and is currently living with man number 6, who is not her husband. So for context, right, a woman in general was often regarded as somewhat less than in the first century world, right? It's just the way that world and society functioned. A Samaritan woman, someone who had been deeply mistrusted by the Jewish people. There's a lot of religious divides that go back many, many centuries and many, many generations there as well. This is a woman whose will would have been constantly overridden by men in her life. This is a woman whose desires would have been probably often disappointed, and at the same time a woman whose desires themselves were also probably deeply disordered, and who may have really wanted some things that were genuinely not good. This is a woman who found herself enslaved to the cultural pressures around her, going to the well at noonday to avoid the crowds in the morning or the evening, at the hottest part of the day, subjecting herself to undue pressure and physical torment because of the cultural pressure that she faced. And into this context of a woman with disordered desires, a deeply wounded heart, and an ineffective will, steps Jesus. And Jesus says, "Woman, would you get me a drink?" To which she replies, "What? You, a Jew, asking me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink?" Jesus says, "If you knew who was asking you, you'd be asking me for a drink. Am I right?" The woman says, "Jesus," well, she doesn't know his name yet, but that's what she would have said if she knew it was Jesus. She says, "Bro," which is, I'm guessing, how she would have talked. "Bro, I don't see that you have anything to get water out of this well with. What are you talking about? You'll give me a drink? Clearly, you don't know what you're talking about." Jesus responds in this way. He says, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." He's not talking about water, though, is he? Right? He's talking about something else. Thirst. A desire within, right? Which gets this core understanding of the heart, the source of our desires and our wills. John D. Rockefeller, one of the richest men in the world at the time of his life, was once asked how much money would be enough for him. And his answer really says it all. Just a little bit more. Desire is insatiable, and yet it was given to us by God. To quote Augustine, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Our desires will constantly be unsatisfied until we find a living water from which we will never thirst again if we drink it. That is what Jesus is saying here. And what he's offering, what his kingdom is about satisfied desires and surrendered wills. The reordering of our desires such that they might be properly satisfied by him in his kingdom, and a surrender of the will. Because here's the reality, right? The heart and the will, they were made to be surrendered to God. They were made to be surrendered to God. The truth is we will surrender them to someone, but you have that choice. You have that agency as to who or what you will surrender your heart to. Is it any surprise that our world is consumed with things like identity, with freedom, and with the freedom of choice? See, what are we talking about here? It's about the heart, the source of our desires, our passions, and our wills, which is so fundamentally core to how we understand ourselves, i.e. our identity as human beings. But of course, ironically, it is only Jesus who can set the heart in its proper place and the proper scheme of functioning in human life. Only Jesus can do that. The restored heart, then, the healing heart, the healed heart, looks like Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. It's that, if you can trust in Jesus and surrender your entire life to him, he will care for your heart, this deepest part of you. He will care for it. He will shepherd your heart such that you no longer will need to want for everything. Right? He will give you everything that you need and even many things that you don't, but that you would really like. Jesus will do that. Not everything, doesn't mean everything's going to go your way, but many things will. And that as you increasingly surrender to him, you will learn to want the things that you need to want and to no longer want the things that are no longer good for you. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And he will so satisfy your needs and your desires that you will be like a sheep who can lie down in a green pasture. A sheep in a green pasture typically is eating, but a sheep that no longer needs to hunger in a green pasture can lie down and rest. That is what the psalm is talking about. We will be able to function increasingly rightly because of God's Spirit within us. God's Spirit inhabiting our spirit. God's heart inhabiting our hearts. As Paul prays in Ephesians 3, I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inmost being, right? Hebrew poetry often uses this idea of repetitive, like cognate. So you have like a thought that is then, it doesn't rhyme in the sense of like a rhyming word, but rhyming thoughts that are paired together. This is, I pray that he will strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inmost being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. That as you trust him, as you surrender to him, that he will literally inhabit your heart. His will become your will. His desires will become your desires. His passions will become your passions. And that our hearts will begin to function as they were intended to again. And so I just want you to consider two things. Is on the one hand, again, consider the places where your heart is wrinkled, where you have not surrendered it to the Lord. The places where you have desired the wrong things, and the places where you have willed the wrong things, where you have made choices that have allowed you to become the kind of person who can eat an entire sleeve of Thin Mints. But whatever that looks like in your life, and odds are you probably know what that is. What are those things, and how did you get there? How did your heart become a raisin? Because what Jesus is offering is living water that can rehydrate our hearts to become grapes again. So think about that in terms of the darkness that's come from within. And then maybe just flip that then and think of the darkness that has come from without. The ways that your heart has been wounded by others. The ways that your desires and have been thwarted and disappointments have really gotten into you deep down to where you've made agreements and said, I'm never going to be happy because I'm not going to be able to find this experience. I'm not going to be able to have this relationship, whatever that may be, where disappointments have gotten into that place in your heart that quenches desire, or where the will of others has overridden your will. And has deeply wounded you there because your will has not been allowed to exercise as it was, not been allowed to function as it was meant to function. You haven't been allowed to exercise your will as you were meant to and created to. Think about those things. Odds are there are places where you know there are people who have wounded your heart. And odds are good that you know there are times that you have wounded others, that evil has come from inside of you. And I guess what I would just offer is that, again, Jesus offers healing as you surrender your heart to him, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. We talked about this idea last week that hurt people hurt people. Well, hurt hearts will hurt other hearts. But in the same way, healed hearts will also heal other hearts. As Jesus said in John 7, let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them. Our world is hurting desperately, and the world needs followers of Jesus who have hearts that are overflowing with rivers of living water, that they might be, that Christ in them might be a source of healing for the world around them. So So I'd like to pray for you today, however you may find yourself, that God would restore your heart, to give you heart again, to take heart, and that you might then be able to extend that to other people. The last note I'll say is that the word encouragement, it comes from the old Latin. I mean, the word courage itself, it comes from Latin. It means to take heart, to take heart. So encouragement is literally to give someone heart. So I just want to pray some encouragement into you, if I may, today. Father, I pray that out of your glorious riches, you may pour your Spirit forth into our inmost being to strengthen us there, that Christ may dwell in our hearts through faith. That as we trust in you and we surrender our lives to you, that you would literally rehydrate the wrinkled raisins that are so often our hearts, to allow them to function properly again. Reorder our desires. Grant the desires of our hearts, Lord, to put the desires in us. Make our wills effective, to choose the good, to will the good in our lives, in our world around us. For everyone whose heart has been broken, Lord, I pray that they would know you near them and that you would bring healing and restoration to their hearts. And for everyone who has, caused the breaking of other hearts, I pray that you would extend your forgiveness and your love, and that in all of it you would bind us up and bring the healing that we so desperately need and long for. And send us forth into the world that as we are being healed, we might extend that same kind of healing presence to others in our lives and in our world. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Well, I'd love to hear from you guys. Reach out and let me know what we can do to help, how we can pray for you. Drop a comment if you're so inclined. Subscribe to this channel if you have not done so already. You can find all the info in the show notes or the comment box or whatever you want to call that beneath this post. How to get connected, how to subscribe to our email list, how you can give online to support the work that we're doing here at Kendricks Creek. Love all that stuff. Love to hear from you. Y'all have a great week. Make a great day, and we will be back next time.